We are in action.
Begin anew. Well, to do a better job of being visible, and my eyes shut not only because the lights are bright, but because I have a need of an eye operation which starts tomorrow for my left eye, which sort of stays shut a lot, and but that's what didn't take me perhaps out of action in the Vietnam War and left me the time to be part of a bunch of events that bring us together today. So just think of it as the little kid who said, "Hey, Mommy, I met the man that started the Independence Trail and he's blind." And it's partly because I get into my right brain and my memory by shutting my eyes. So that's the explanation of that. And I was reminded by a member of the audience that the detail that John Muir's other eye went blind in sympathy. And so he was really almost totally blind in that darkened room. And one doctor said, "You'll get better," and the other one said, "You probably won't." And of course he did get better. He always had problems with that eye, but that's the direction that moved him to the Amazon. Now, I'd like to have us leap into John Muir's 4 years after the tree and the windstorm story, and we'll read some accounts of that next time. And in between, hopefully, several of us will go up to the Oregon Peak Lookout and look around for where he wrote the famous story that you all thought it was somewhere else like Yosemite. But if you read it closely, it says, "Between the Feather and Yuba watersheds." Now, that was 1875 and December 1874. Now, at the same time, he's climbing Mount Shasta, which he's exploring all of the Sierra more than anybody else in single trips. You know, he just going up and down canyons, and he had incredible endurance for both not eating very much, which he learned from his father's the life on the farm, and also from the strength he got from being a 11, 12, 13-year-old running a big plow. But Mount Shasta's way up here, you know, at the top of the California miniature continent, which we are all aware that we're really the smallest subcontinent in the world. We're not in India, but we're a subcontinent with all the tallest, largest, oldest, and smallest trees in the world. And the most numbers of indigenous peoples' languages all in one place in the temperate regions. We know that California is a giant arena, and we teach about it. We teach about it with putting our hands together like this. And when you put your hands together. Everybody. I see somebody with their sandwich got their hands together. Okay. So the right hand is the San Joaquin Valley, and these are the San Joaquin River and the Merced River and the Tuolumne. And the left hand is the Sacramento Valley. If you had a wart right here, that's the Sutter Buttes. And the Coast Range is the fleshy parts of your palm. Your lifelines are the Sacramento River and the San Joaquin River, and then they join to go down to San Francisco Bay. Now, I use that to teach school kids. And this California Great Valley watershed, there is a Great Valley in the east. The Shenandoah Valley is a Great Valley that's sort of a mirror image to the east, but it's just not a whole total system. We're a King Solomon's Mines kind of fairy story, like the Hollywood movie that impressed me as a kid, where there was some world in there that was so isolated by deserts that nobody had been there, and you had to go across miles and miles of deserts, and then you found, a civilization and gold and diamonds and evil, all of those things. And California was a hidden land because to the north, the forests were so totally dense you couldn't get down to it unless you were by boat coming along the shore. Either just at the time the glaciers were melting, there were land 3 miles offshore today, but it had trees on it too. And so you either had to go down the coast in boats, as the first Americans, first Californians. The desert isolated us here and here, And so California wasn't explored nearly as soon as so many other things. And even when the Spaniards were here, they didn't fully explore it. And so it actually stayed as a pretty beautiful place long enough for John Muir to get to see it before the gold rush had wrecked it. And so then John Muir, going up to climb Mount Shasta, is the pinnacle of his California subcontinent adventures. He's climbing it in 1874 and 75, and he meets people working for a man named Davidson. And Davidson is going to eventually help found the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco and have a Mount Davidson named for him. He's also going to get his name on Virginia City, the greatest mining rush in the world, the richest gold ore in the world, more than California, gold and silver and other riches, which has a lot to do with Bridgeport, where we are. And Mount Davidson is named because Davidson's working for the Coastal Survey in the 1860s and 50s. And that means they are surveying, under the Treasury Department, the boundaries with Canada. They're surveying places in Puget Sound. They're surveying sites that will be Civil War forts, like Angel Island. And so Davidson, they see their money running out a little bit in the Civil War. How do they they've mapped the whole East Coast and the whole West Coast. What's the Coastal Survey going to do to keep getting money in Washington? Well, they're also aware that the British and the French have been mapping things all over the world. I'll just hold this up briefly by myself. There is the actual map of the world, and here's a north-south line used by the French to establish the meaning of the meter, which is right there. That line there is measurements, a north-south meridian used by the French to establish the exact measurement of the meter as 1/10,000th or something of the distance around a quarter of a way around the world. And then here's a bunch of lines in India that the British did. Now those are used to help measure the world more accurately than the Greeks or the Egyptians, who, by the way, it's pretty likely the Egyptians had measured the earth more accurately than the Greeks, and the Greeks were just telling you some of what the Egyptians had done. Because the Egyptians knew about the different lengths of degrees of latitude, depending how far you were from the earth, from the equator. And so, thinking about John Muir as the master of continents, wants to go to the center of this one and this one, it's inevitable that in meeting the man on Shasta, he is hired to take a barometer up in April. And you and I listened maybe to the account at the John Muir conference in 2001, unbelievable account of him describing being stuck on the top of Shasta with Jeremy Fay with a barometer in a snowstorm and trying to jump up and down and keep warm and more like a legend, lie down in the mud pots and be baked on one side and frozen on the other, and rotate yourself like a hot dog between an ice, like a hot dog on a rotating thing in a refrigerator, and freezing and scalding. And so he always had a bad leg called Old Shasta. Well, so in the 1870s, even while he was on Shasta meeting Mr. Sargent, I believe, Augustus Sargent, they established a relationship that the Coast Survey was going to get money from Congress, starting to get money from Congress in order to measure America. And to measure America for measuring the world. Well, John Muir's really into the continents of the world. So in 1878, after going up the American River, which is very wild, above the gold mining stops, and John Muir's in the wilderness of the North Fork American River, and or the Middle and South Forks. And he comes down in the spring of about June 1878 to Sacramento. And who does he meet in Sacramento but his friend Augustus Rogers, who has got more funding with Davidson. And Davidson has made a plan of how they're going to triangulate the 39 degree of latitude across America, which is this is the upper, well, it's sort of the lower line here. Let's call the lower line here 39 degrees, Point Arena to Cape May, New Jersey. And so they say, we don't have much money. How would you like, with your great skills of mountain climbing, because he'd saved Jeremy Fay's life when they, barely made it out of there and stayed all night in the blizzard on top of the mountain. They said, you're the strongest man we know. Will you go with us? We will pay for your food and a little bit extra, just a little bit extra. And if you'll join us, we're going to triangulate Nevada and Utah as part of measuring North America. Well, so that's going to be this line here, and that line is finished in the year 1900. It takes them 30 years to do it. And by the time that they've done it, he works in 1878, and in 1894, here is Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. plotting the 39th parallel through the Rockies, 1894. That gave me I finally figured out what Muir was doing in 1878. So this is what Muir was doing in 1878. He rode horseback with them up all of these mountains. But this same system of mountaintop observatories, which you can all find by climbing Mount Lola. How many here have climbed Mount Lola? Good. So did you see the little stonework on top? Now you know what it's for. Here is what's called the Davidson Quadrilateral. Mount Diablo, Mount St. Helena, Mount Lola, Carson Pass, Round Top, and even Mount Conness, which is a congressman that started Yosemite State Park. And all these points, they went up on horseback and started a benchmark that then would become an observatory with stonework. The observatory would be big enough around for a person to be inside it in a windstorm and just have one little window open and canvas all around it, so that the rocks of the mountaintop held the instrument and the observer would just blink his eyelashes and not touch the thing. And they got an accuracy of 2,600 miles and 80 feet, just like a primitive GPS or something, pretty good accuracy. So what I'm bringing into that is Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. marries his wife's, Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. marries his wife's, his brother's widow. So when his brother dies and he's never married, sometimes this was done to take care of the family. There was no head of the family. He married his sister-in-law, and John Charles Olmsted was the son. And so there are 3 Olmsteds making parks across America for 95 years, and the state park system has a huge leap because the son, who was doing that in 1894, made 2 major studies of the state parks that should be created in 1920s and 1940s. Now, in between that, Frederick Olmsted Jr., who never used the name Jr., and his birth certificate said Edward. Somehow his father changed his name to Frederick Law when he was 4 years old. And he was called Fred, and he was called several different names. But how many of you ever met Fred Myers in the state park system before he died? Anybody here? Fred Meyer was a person working in the California State Park System in 1977 when I and my second wife Sally, who may be here next month, went down to start getting the money for the Yuba River State Park without knowing it. We were just starting the Independence Trail. And Fred Meyer told us how important Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. was to the state park system. So I'm hoping that by next time we'll have copies of the Frederick Law Olmsted papers, the plans, the lists of the parks that he recommended, but the one we know he recommended Anza-Borrego, and we know he recommended Sutter Buttes. So let's leave this all behind, and except I can't help tell you that the pathway to Bridgeport, which is long and tortured, includes the fact that the most unique tower of all of them, because in the east they had to build towers above the forests. There were so many forests back here, they built double slender timber oil derrick type towers, one to support the observer and one to support the 200 or 300 pound theodolite. And that's what allowed them this incredible accuracy of 1.25 million or something. Here is the most unique tower of the 100 or more they built. This one is built upstream where the Jughandle Creek watershed and Casper Creek watershed go into the little fork of Big River, which is now a 14,000 acre state park. And this tower gave its name to Observatory Hill at the Mendocino Woodlands camps, and nobody knew what it was. It's all forgotten. And this tower has a redwood in the middle with all the branches cut, and a scaffolding built through the wicker work of the theodolite tower to support the observer. It shows you the ingenuity of these people that were working on a total budget yearly for 30 years of $15,000 a year. It's the kind of thing where they were paying John Muir maybe $1 a day or something, and he was making his money by sending newspaper articles to San Francisco, which is how he became famous. His newspaper and magazine articles preceded his books. So we're going to leave Muir, leap ahead to Frederick Law Olmsted, who, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., who in 1915 helps write the key words for the National Park System, the Organic Act or something. He wrote those words, and I'm sure they were in the program, were they not? Did they talk about Junior? Did they? Yeah, okay. So then in the 1920s, he has brought out, he's been doing the subdivision, the incredible park-like subdivision of Palos Verdes Estates, and his brother dies in 1920, but from 1900, when the senior Olmsted was in a sanitarium he had designed the grounds for, the bridging John Charles Olmsted took over, and it became the Olmsted Brothers Landscape Architects of Brookline, Massachusetts. And how many of you have been to the National Historic Site made out of Frederick Olmsted's house in Boston? Anybody? Well, it's closed now. So if you go to Boston next year, it'll be reopened. It has all of the plans for all of the parks of all the cities across America that were done in 95 years of park planning by the three Olmsteds. And when John Charles had died, then Frederick Law Jr., never using the name Jr., so it's still Frederick Law. You see, it's as if he's making parks for 95 years. He works for the East Bay Regional Parks, and he works for the California State Park System, which has had its origins in, especially around the redwoods, so that the founders worked with the co-founding of the Save the Redwoods League, and a great deal of it had to do with that. The expansion of the California State Park System into landscapes of the whole state is very importantly dealt with Frederick Law Jr., because you see, he's been trained by his father. He's been to the wild Rocky Mountains, which his father had not, but his father sends him to the survey, the Measure America, but he's learning about wild parks. And so more than Frederick Law Olmsted Sr., Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. works with the wild parks in California as his great contribution, and there's not enough said about that. As we know, there are how many units in the state park system?
279.
279. Well, his outlines of parks that ought to be, probably 2/3 of the ones he outlined have been made, and it's going to be fun to look up and get the data on that for the next session. So let's take down our background of the 1920s, and let's notice that this is actually a national parks map also. This, in the total acreage of North America, it's still pretty small, but you can see these are not national forests, I believe. These are, oh yes they are. So the national forests are the big blocks. National Park Service is the little purple things. So you see they aren't taking up, but in the Sierra they are taking up big areas between the national forests, and we have a continuous national forests and national parks in the Sierra, and a great many of these things are north-south, the Appalachians. Okay, so now the development of the country is that everything's becoming private except in these. The state of Nevada is 90% federal, however, so Bureau of Land Management lands aren't shown on here. But I do want to, in leaving the 39th parallel, I want you to sort of picture it as the Cadillac of the surveys of America, and as a way in which the exact boundaries with Canada and Mexico were to be established, and as a greater accuracy than the topo maps you get, which were run by the U.S. Geological Survey. The Coast Survey became the Coast and Geodetic Survey, and now it's under NOAA, but it transferred from the Treasury Department to the Department of Interior, I believe. And we're going to now skip ahead to 1970, not knowing exactly which parks Frederick Olmsted succeeded in getting, although Big Sur and some of those are the ones that he surveyed the landscapes of California from the eye of a family that's the father of landscape architecture in America. But he's even better at looking at the natural landscapes perhaps than his father, or he's more trained because he's had a longer time in the outdoors. So here is now suddenly we see in California, look at the size of both the national parks, but here's Anza Borrego State Park. And as we see, the national forests in here are the gray, and this is the way I found things, the way they were in 1967 when I was at the Wilderness Conference as the exhibits chairman, and my color slides were grabbed by a landscape architect, trained by all landscape architects learning about Frederick Olmsted. He realized I must be a cousin. He made me a $1,000 grant to go 100 years after John Muir and walk across California in his footsteps. And I sort of thought that's what I was going to do because I had been born 100 years before John Muir. And then I went out to look and see what I was going to find and lay out the trip in advance. And I found, as I've said to many people, found so many farms, freeways, smog, cities, canals, and feedlots that I could not, as an ecologist and photographer, get any thrill out of walking across it. I would have to be a historian, because the great flowery lake bed of golden composite was gone. 400-mile wildflower valley was no more. It was was to be the vegetable garden of the world, and it was. So I said to the landscape architects, could I possibly use the money to find a wilder way across California? John Muir said to a carpenter on Market Street, or John Muir said to a carpenter on Market Street, send me somewhere that's wild. And they sent him to Berkeley.
Yeah.
Next time I'll do the talking John Muir blues with a guitar.
That's how we feel about it in Stanford.
That's how we feel about it at USC too.
Okay. So, anyway, I went up. I'd already been to Mendocino. I even have a magazine sitting here that tells that story. Well, I don't think it's, thought I was organized enough for that. Came in here. It's a magazine of the Mendocino Art Center. How many of you have been to Mendocino in the art context? Anybody? Okay. My wealthy aunt made a loan to the Mendocino Art Center in 1964, and it was very relevant to us up here because the twin cities of Nevada City and Grass Valley are analogous to the twin cities of Mendocino and Fort Bragg. Each one has a successful industrial, larger community and a ghost town of the more failed community. And that left the property values down in those places. And so the revolution came to Nevada City almost as soon as it came to Mendocino, but in 1957, an artist, Bill Zaka, went up and realized that that real estate was very good, price was very low, and he would make an art colony in Mendocino. So sometime around 1960, a mansion had burned down. It was the biggest mansion in the town of Mendocino. And he learned that a guy was going to offer to buy it at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And so he went there at 1:30 and said, well, how much do you want for it? Because it was a wreck with just the wreckage of the house. The whole block in Mendocino where the art center is today. And the guy said, well, $12,000. And so Bill Zaka said, well, how much do you want for it? You don't offer first, you ask them first and see if it's the right thing. He said, well, how about $50? So half an hour ahead of time, the Mendocino Art Center is born. If it didn't ask for a loan from my wealthy aunt, I wouldn't have gone up there. They gave me a free place in the catalog that summer teaching a art and photography class for 3 weeks, and I stayed in Bill Zaka's house, and I had lunch with the 8-year-old daughter last week. And the 50th anniversary of the Mendocino Art Center now has a book, but out of that was going to come the completely strange thing that for $300, 10 years later, I would be buying $210,000 worth of land, which would become the $10 million Jug Handle State Park and the $1 million farm and nature center next to it, where you can all stay overnight. And the beach of which, Jug Handle Beach, is the actual parent, in a way, of this park. Because without money from buying Jug Handle Park, there wasn't the money for the down payment to keep this land right here from being, say, a motel or hostelry. So the ladies that had this wanted a hostelry. And this was, as you know, the coal ranch, and later the Nebo Ranch. But the coal Gold Rush Ranch was divided down the middle of the Yuba River with some juggling that went on with the, what's the name of the ranch over there? Because I bought it.
Cranston?
What?
Cranston?
No, I'll get it in a minute. Anyway, there was a mirror image ranch on the north side of the river, and those two ranches make the majority of what the park is here today. And all of a sudden, in 1981, the property price dropped from $350,000 for that one, which went all the way across Englebright. The northwest corner was on the other side of Englebright, included Point Defiance, and all the way up to the beginning of the windy, rocky part of the Buttermilk Bend Trail. And complete with that pre-trail on it, that 290 acres was for sale. Suddenly, in 1 week, the price was dropped from $350,000 to $250,000 because there were flowage easements on it, as there were on this, to allow them to to dredge Englebright and put it, pile it up here. And so that was a cloud on the motel, but an RV park, was more transitory. So that was, the people that were buying that were looking at an RV park over there. But they did say, nope, we might want to do something more, and it was an investment. We can't take the risk they're going to put dredge spoils on our land. And it went to 250, and in 1 week, 25,000 from Jug Handle, 25,000 from the Garden of Allah Hotel at Sunset Boulevard, and 25,000 from a German engineering firm come down to their kids, made the down payment on this, and that took 3 years then to get the legislation. So I'll describe that in greater detail next time when Sally is here. And how many of you are not going to be here next time? Well, just a couple. Well, we'll do that in greater depth. But those events then of the Mendocino Art Center getting me up there as a botanist, discovering that was the place the Mexican and Canadian plants came together. That gave me the realization that we needed to have a classroom outside the art center where we could study the pygmy forest, the world's smallest forest, and next to the world's tallest forest, the redwoods, in an area where the redwood industry began and the redwoods were vanishing. So somebody offered us some virgin redwoods at an incredibly cheap price. We started to buy it. The deal fell through because of Nature Conservancy rules called acre by acre, where you can save some of it and get some saved with a down payment. And that, putting out your eye with a sharp file to our dreams, was the best thing that could happen, because that gave us the $5,000 down for the $210,000 piece of land. And of course that had a ways it changed. But so I'm, as the ending today, to show you how Jug Handle is your parent here and get you to go over there. Jug Handle State Park is 1976 and is completed in 1976. I'm going to take this down, but I want you to notice the way the highways and the cities clutter everything up, so that in 1968, when I'm surveying how do I want to walk across California, I also have been noticing, having grown up at the corner of Sunset and Sepulveda Boulevard in LA, where I picked wildflowers for my mother, and where the hills of UCLA were just a bunch of bike trails for me when I wasn't on my paper route, delivering to the fraternities. All of that was, of course, going to change so much that the birds that lived in that sagebrush scrub would become endangered species. And the whole idea for us to focus on is what we can call endangered species of landscapes. And it is what Frederick Olmsted Jr. had to do when he pointed out potential state parks that were in between the national parks. And that was having enough understanding of the natural landscape to recognize some of those rarities. And for that reason, the odyssey of John Olmsted's 1968 walk across California had to change into just using the money that year to going across and seeing what state parks there were across Highway 20, because the missing park in the middle of Sutter Buttes was obviously, with the waterfowl refuges around it, the only place left across the valley that would stay wild enough for people to do a John Muir across California walk in the future, even with rice fields in between them. So that preview of Highway 20 got me involved with buying the redwood forest, which fell through, which got us to start saving the world's most complete ecology story. It's called The Longest Story of Soil Evolution. And there's a wonderful Swiss soil scientist named Dr. Hans Jenny, who is foot shorter than I am. And he is to study the pygmy forest. And so I guess I've got these all back. Well, I don't have these all backwards. So here's the town of Mendocino, and here is the dream, you see. This is what I could have shown at the beginning of the talk, but I'll show at the end today. The Indigenous Peoples Day 4 years ago had this necklace for sale. And that explains what, when people thanked me as the father of the Independence Trail, I needed some way to show them the whole dream. And you see, it's a much bigger dream. It actually is a dream that on the streetcar in San Francisco, when I chased it for 2 miles, and when I got onto it and collapsed in the back seat, having even had time to leap in front of it and see which is the right one, I suddenly realized there's nothing you can't do if you do not give up, and that I related to John Muir and Frederick Law Olmsted, or at least to Frederick Law Olmsted, that the next movement of parks in America, that was 1964, 65, needed to be to fill in the missing spaces, especially the east-west spaces, and that we needed a system of east-west heritage corridors across the country and across California, and connecting the state parks in an east-west direction in a state where the parks are aligned in north-south directions. So this is what the dream was, but there wasn't time to do the walk because suddenly, how do we raise $210,000 when we only have $5,000 down? And so here was the town of Mendocino that became the art colony. The same ecology of a headland where the wells all go dry in September because there's 10 feet of beach sand under this, and this used to be under the ocean. And we'll have the map of that next year, but this ecology that has tall forests who don't do their recycling and become small forests exists in 3 other state parks at Mendocino, and 10 little creeks and rivers divided that 30 miles of Mendocino coast into giant ecological staircases. Now, from this art center, and from me being a naturalist in Golden Gate Park, was to evolve Jug Handle as an outdoor Golden Gate Park with, instead of dwarf conifer gardens and eucalyptus trees and Monterey cypress and pines colonizing the sand dunes, natural forests colonizing sand dunes made on a rising coastline in which the beach, and this is Jug Handle Beach, is part of a giant escalator with a rising coastline. Everything underwater here will be a headland like this 100,000 years in the future. As the coast goes up a foot every 1,000 years, the glaciers, running about every 100 to 200,000 years, cause the sea level to drop as much as to make 3 miles of land out here. And then they come eating their way back when the glaciers melt, which is what, of course, now we're getting a rise in sea level. And it's been even higher. We've had the sea level 30 feet higher. So as it eats its way back, the old coastline like this is up in the air, and it becomes a low hill. So as the ocean recedes to the west and a rising coastline from plate tectonics, the pygmy forests are the old age stage of the pine forests that evolved on the coastal terraces. And so here is, we go inland in Jug Handle Park. We walk from the beach and from the tide pools, which are incredible. Those are John Woolman school students from Nevada City at some of the very best tide pools. They're also very dangerous to get down to, and there's a problem of managing the Jug Handle Park, and that is, how do you have the abalone divers and everything managing and all the coastal trails not eroding, killing your park from rapid erosion. Now the headland, this is the headland that was a big fight with the motel, and I'll mention that a little more next time, but the bulldozer was stopped here 4 times, and the last time it was a snowstorm that stopped it. And the snowstorm stopped the bulldozer at the southernmost dwarf Sitka spruces from Alaska, as if nature bats last. And if you go inland, there's a tall forest made of Canadian and Alaskan and Mexican trees. And after that, there is a redwood forest that's on sand dunes. And so last week, I guided the 4th grade students from Nevada City School of the Arts. It's the first trip of people from Nevada City going to Jug Handle and understanding it was part of their South Yuba River parks. And so we taught them about the whole necklace. I took it to class before they went. And we walked up the ecological staircase trail, and these are the Woolman's faculty getting ready to design a trip for Woolman kids about 10 years ago. And then when you've been through the redwood forest, it has sand dunes and drainage, so it doesn't become pygmy forest. If you don't have drainage, you're going to become a dwarf forest, and this is the pygmy forest. The few tall trees you see have their roots through a hard pan, and I'll have maps if any of you want a Jug Handle map. I have some cheap ones because the termites ate up about 20 laterally, and then genetics meant that there was a mutation for one that went straight through them. So you get a Jug Handle map for $5 instead of $10 because it's got one little tiny hole in it. And I have at least one for somebody today. But anyway, saving that ecological staircase is the world's most complete story of soil succession. The miracle of that gave us this $25,000 to buy this. So, and the timing was always very tight, just like the half-hour timing, or the half-hour timing on the Mendocino Arts Center. The people that were going to build a golf course on the 210,000 piece, so it would look like the 9-hole golf course in Grass Valley with a red house as the clubhouse. We now have the red house as the hostel you can stay in. So next time you go to Jug Handle, you go to the website. My website's Restore California. And our new name for our nonprofit we founded as Cal Institute of Man and Nature, the new name is Mendocino Tahoe Conservancy. So I think that gives you a little background for the beginnings, and this is where maybe a few of us will go to visit the Oregon Creek Lookout, the Oregon Peak Lookout. And so this is where John Muir writes The Tree in the Windstorm, and we'll take up our wandering narrative next week, including that we wouldn't have got, to get the 25,000 back from Jug Handle, we had to have saved the Independence Trail. And this is the origins of the Independence Trail. This is the half blown up dam 3 miles east of 49 Bridge, still on private property, which diverted the Yuba River water into the canal that had to go through the same saddle as the Virginia Turnpike Company. So the same saddle that gave you the toll bridge here gave the surveyors for the Excelsior Mining and Canal Company in Smartsville, when it was really mostly Suckers Flat. So the Suckers Flat Canal Company in 1855 or so, about, pretty close to when the Virginia Turnpike Company was formed, has to build canals from the Deer Creek to Smartsville area, Suckers Flat, and transfer water across Deer Creek because the other miners had already got the water. And the nearest water for their mine was going to have to be to get it out of the Yuba. So they just put the surveyor at Pleasant Valley School, future site, and said, okay, the grade is 10 feet per mile, do your thing. And they were very good at surveying. And they surveyed 10 feet per mile all the way, the whole course of what you've seen in the Independence Trail, and 3 miles east And so there's the head dam, and here we'll sort of close with your most immediate origins, and that means that actually the Independence Trail Corporation, it's then called Sequoia Challenge, actually bought the north side of Bridgeport for the $250,000, with no guarantee the state would want it. So this is the final picture, and here's the 1995 remnant of the mining flume number 1 going around the corner to that head dam we just saw. And this is a marijuana plant. And this is some of the only handful of chamise bushes in the Yuba River watershed. It's the most important chaparral plant in California, and it made a lot of the smoke and the acres that burned in LA. Chamise is the dominant plant in the California chaparral community, and somehow it skips from the Forest Hill Divide at the confluence of the American River, where there's lots of it, up in the Feather, where there's lots of it, and there's only a handful of them. And these at the Yuba River are 10 feet high, and they look like a spirea. So I'm thankful that most of you were able to stay awake before lunch and missing the lunch, and we'll meet again in a month.
All right. Fantastic.
Could you repeat those websites?
RestoreCalifornia.net has links to Jug Handle and Independence Trail. But RestoreCalifornia.net is the Mendocino Tahoe Conservancy